Dawn gathered along the endless spine of the city world and drew a thin aurora across the permacrete canyons. When the night winds slackened, the hum of the skylanes returned like the surf of an ocean that no one on Coruscant had ever seen. Luke stood beneath the shadow of the old temple and let the sound wash through him. Millions of lives thinking, speaking, worrying, laughing. A chorus braided with the staccato of repulsors and the silver hiss of weather systems drawing rain from towers. He breathed in, and the city breathed with him. The force didn't just thread through Coruscant. It flooded it, restless and vibrant, the living force in motion. R2-D2 warbled at his side, a note of impatience and curiosity. The droid's dome reflected the pale widening light and the chipped, massive doors ahead, the ones that had once opened to receive younglings in brown robes and closed upon the marching boots of the 501st. "I hear it too," Luke said, without quite knowing what he meant. He put his gloved hand on the seam between doors that Palpatine's masons had fused when he converted Sanctum to Palace. Beneath imperial ornament, the old sigil still lived like fossil beneath basalt. "We're going inside." They had cleared the rights for entry 2 days prior. Mon Mothma's signature still crisp on a datapad that R2 bobbed up from his scomp link. An authorization as quiet as an apology.
"No speeches, not even."
The New Republic didn't want to look as if it were enthroning mystics. The temple was to be a place of study, of service, a school, not a fortress, if it was to be anything at all. Luke had asked for nothing more. A crane the size of a gunship hung suspended above the front steps. Workers in orange harnesses signaled. Cables tightened. Old plates moaned. A final metallic shriek echoed down the canyon of the steps. And then the seam cracked, dust billowed, and the doors of the Jedi opened to morning. Luke went in alone first. He walked through a hollowed vestibule where Imperial banners had once drowned the light. Dust sifted through like snow. The silence had a contour, a shape remembered by stone. He saw where fountains had been capped and replaced by marching galleries of triumph, where the sandbox where the very young had practiced floating pebbles had been floored over in black marble. He didn't mourn as he expected to. The mourning had been happening his whole life. He let the Force show him the seams. The temple was still a temple. It had been waiting patiently beneath masks. The steps to the archives were 2 levels down. He took them slowly, one hand along the rail, hearing faint resonances of the past. 1,000 footfalls, excited voices, the hooting of training remotes, Master Yoda's cane ticking stone like a metronome. In the hall of 1,000 fountains, the stone ribs had lost their water and the basins were dusty moons. Luke touched one basin's rim and the Force answered with a ripple. R2 rolled behind him, churring, and extended a lamp that made a long wedge of light. "You feel it?" Luke asked. "This is where we begin." He coaxed open a service hatch in the stacks and found the narrow stair that led to a maintenance corridor. At the bottom, with the help of a field pack and a pry bar, he opened the first of the sealed vault doors. It gave reluctantly, and then the smell of trapped, dry air drifted out, the aroma of paper that had survived the ash of an empire. "Records," Luke whispered, the word thick as a prayer. "Stories." He found holocrons locked in honeycomb racks, half the matrices intact, half fractured into glass dust. The ones that still pulsed faintly when his fingers hovered over them made soft harmonic sounds that rang like tuning forks in the mind. He didn't reach for them yet. He stood, eyes closed, letting the sensation rise and pass. Then he felt it. A presence behind him and above him, light on the step, patient, as if it had been waiting in a doorway. "Be mindful of the now," came a voice that had both weight and laughter. "The past is a river, the future a sea. You are walking the shore." Luke didn't turn. "Ben?" he asked softly, though he knew it wasn't Obi-Wan's timbre. The past stepped closer, and the scent of rain in parched soil seemed to enter the vault. "Attachment is not the enemy. Fear is the enemy." The voice's cadence was unlike the old Republic scholar's serenity. This one belonged to the one Obi-Wan had called a maverick with fondness that hid worry. "The living force hums in this world city like a hive of suns. It is wise to build where the song is strong." "Qui-Gon," Luke said and tasted wonder. I hoped you would come. A wry warmth in answer, and the pressure of a hand on his shoulder without weight. You are not here to remake the past. You are here to let the present live. When he opened his eyes, he was alone with humming crystals and dust motes turning like planets in lamplight. But he was not alone in the way that mattered. He looked at the shelves again, with less ache and more curiosity. He had come to Coruscant to build because this was where the wound lay, where a generation had been betrayed at its heart. If the city could be healed, perhaps the galaxy would follow. He had not come to rise above the people. He had come to live among them. By the time workers returned with light towers and filtration units, Luke had marked out the spaces that would breathe again. The Hall of 1,000 Fountains, the training rooms where children would learn to listen before they leapt, the refectory that would open its doors to refugees and senators alike. He reserved an upper tower for sleeping cells that would look out across air lanes and cloud bands, and the circular chamber whose windows had once framed sunrise for a council would become a place of quiet, but not power. Never again a throne. In the afternoon, he found the statue of the saber tree in an old antechamber. It had survived because the Empire had loved trophies and peculiarities. This one was neither, and so it had been ignored. Its roots carved into a wheeling knot, its branches a spiral of stylized leaves. Luke knelt before it and rested his palm on the cold bark. A current rose through his spine, and memories that were not his darted close like fish, younglings laughing. A clone trooper in white, pausing to let a small girl pass. A knight whose eyes shone with tears after the loss of a friend on a world of ice. The clone wars lay in these stones like iron in blood. He didn't recoil from the memory of clones. He felt the choice inside their choices, the way they had been bent, the way good had been used against itself. There was a lesson in that, too. He would teach the young to recognize the shape of coercion before it arrived in uniforms and orders. He would give them words for their instincts and families for their hearts. That evening, the Chancellor came with a small escort. Mon Mothma had the air of a teacher who had seen too many funerals and learned to keep walking. She looked around the rehabilitated vestibule with careful eyes. "This will stir old arguments," she said at last. "It should," Luke said. "But we won't answer them with silence. We'll answer with work." She nodded. "We're not a warrior government anymore, Luke. I would be lying if I said the Senate, as it is now, is dependable. There are those who fear any order like this. There are those who will want to use it. We will not be used," Luke said. "And we will not use. We will serve." "To serve," she said, a little smile like a lantern. "Good. Serve whom?" "Life," he said. "All of it. The living force. The people who live here and the people who come with nothing to eat and the people beneath the levels who can't hear anyone say their names." Mon Mothma looked toward a bricked archway that would soon be opened to become a kitchen. She seemed to imagine it with him. "A school, a hospital, a table," she murmured. "I think I can sell that. The temple will be a gift to the city." Artu chirped a proud chord. Luke bowed his head. "It will be a gift we tend, not own." They walked together then through the half-lit corridors, past scaffolds and cut cables and the bones of old furniture. Luke showed her the Hall of Fountains and told her how water would run again, and how the lower doors would be opened every day, wide enough for the droids who came to be repaired and the elders who needed warmth. He showed her the archive vaults and spoke about preserving not only the old holocrons but stories from the long, quiet years of rebellion. Small acts, local guardians, village midwives who had smuggled medicine beneath stormtrooper noses. He wanted the children to know that heroism wasn't the exclusive province of knights who leapt from gunship doors. "You make me think this might work," Mon Mothma said softly when they reached the upper terrace. The light had gone gold, and the traffic lanes painted streaks across the sky like calligraphy. Far off, the old Senate district lay like a cut jewel in the haze. "It will," Luke said, and then he was shy, because certainty always made him feel as if he were borrowing someone else's stature. "It can. With patience." A shadow crossed her expression then, a cloud scudding over the mind. "Not everyone will be patient." She hesitated. "Have you told Leia?" Luke smiled. "Yes. She advised me to bring extra chairs." "Of course she did." Mon Mothma's smile had salt and light. I will send a charter to the committee in the morning, and I will come for dinner when your kitchen opens, and I expect your stew to be better than ration bars. I'll add rations to the stew, Luke said, solemn. That way nobody loses. The Chancellor laughed, and he heard the sound echo up into Tower Ribs that had not heard laughter in a lifetime. When she left, the light had dimmed to amethyst, and the first stars were rising between lanes. Luke stood a long while watching them, thinking not of stars but of windows, the domestic lights of ordinary apartments in towers, the brief flare as someone cooked or read or turned in after a long shift. Each small light a person breathing. 3 weeks later the temple began to breathe too. Water ran again, not in all the fountains, but in two that sang like first words. A kitchen opened a side door at dawn. By midday, the line of workers, drivers, dock loaders, and delivery droids curled down the stone steps, and by evening a child from level 1325 could look up and say shyly, "Thank you, Master Skywalker," and not be afraid. He made a point to kneel when he spoke to them. He had seen enough thrones. He did not recruit with banners or scanners. He listened. In the line, in the refectory, in the hospitals of neighboring towers, in the little schools run by exhausted volunteers, on the transit lines where he took a seat like anyone else and watched the glow of faces going home. The Force nudged him toward certain conversations, certain small hands, certain old men who had never learned to breathe past their grief and now began to, one breath at a time. The first to come to his classes was a Mirialan girl named Tala Neris, whose grandmother came every day for tea. Tala had a way of reaching for a mug on the table, frowning when it slid a centimeter instead of 3, and then laughing at herself as if she'd told a private joke. The second was a Twi'lek boy named Kessaver, who confessed that the drips in the ceiling spoke to him in patterns. He repeated the patterns until his little brother slept without nightmares. The third was a dockworker's son named Yassik Vale, a quiet human with a scar like a comma on his chin who never spoke loudly and always noticed when someone else needed water. Luke watched how they moved around one another, how they shared without instruction, how they failed without shame. He remembered his own boyhood on a world of sand, learning to keep moisture in jars and hope alive in the cracks between chores. He made his classes like that, not lofty, not severed from daily use. Breath and balance, noticing the bitter with the sweet, listening to what was present instead of what should be. Ben came because Leia asked him to help. He was taller each time Luke saw him, somewhere between boy and almost not boy, a body lengthening like a sapling and a gaze that flickered between mischief and inwardness. He arrived with Han, who pretended the temple was an amusement he tolerated and not a place that made him fidget with the absence of exits. Ben crossed the vestibule with his hands in his pockets in a way that made Luke think of his father and then wince because you could be too sentimental about such things. Ben's presence in the Force was strong and untidy, like a warehouse full of fireworks before a holiday. "Kid," Han said, tipping his head at Luke, "you listen to your uncle. Couple of hours. Then we grab noodles. Can I have extra sweet salt?" Ben asked. "Sure," Han said, "as long as Luke pays." Luke bowed, unable to keep a grin down. "That seems fair." Ben tried his first breathing exercise like a person holding a sparrow, gently only because he feared to crush something delicate. After 2 minutes, the sparrow wriggled free. Ben coughed, scowled, and threw himself into a tumble that the younger kids stopped to watch with open mouths. Kessa applauded. Tala rolled her eyes and then showed him, without words, how to make space in his chest for a breath that reached the soles of his feet. Luke watched a moment that was not dramatic or famous, and he felt a gratitude that made his palms warm. The Force working the way it liked to work best, through play and cooperation and the attention of children. After class, Leia came. She didn't speak. She stood in the shadow of a column, her scent of soap and paper, her mind like a river shaped by a long gorge. Luke walked over after the younglings had fled to the kitchen for sweet buns. "You're happy," Leia said, not precisely as a question. "I am," Luke said, "and afraid. Those two things keep trading places." "That's life," Leia said dryly, but her eyes were softer than her voice. "You're doing good here. It's right. Will you sit with us?" he asked. She shook her head. Not yet. My path is ugly and necessary. But I'll walk past your door whenever I need to remember why we do it. You don't need me to remind you. No, she said quietly. But I like that you do. When the Senate committee convened to formalize the temple's status, Luke wore a plain tunic that had dried starch unevenly. He took no weapon. He brought R2 because a droid could carry more law than any human, and because R2 had a way of making rooms pay attention to long memory. Leia spoke as advocate, and Mon Mothma presided like a mother bird watching a nest full of hungry beaks. The opposition was led by Senator Lon Iver, a man whose collar always seemed too tight and whose smile had the thin caution of someone who had never forgotten being hungry. "Will your order," Iver said, enunciating the word as if it had thorns, "accept the oversight of civilian authority?" "Yes," Luke said at once. "We are not above the law. We are its servants, where the law serves life." The senator frowned, perhaps because he'd expected evasion. "And will you take children from their homes?" "We will not take anyone," Luke said calmly. "We will invite. We will teach families as families. Attachment is not the enemy. Fear is." He said it the way Qui-Gon had said it to him, and when his voice fell still, he felt that whisper of rain on his skin again. He met Iver's eyes and saw surprise waver there, and perhaps a small envy he refused to shame. Another senator, a woman with hair like braided silver conduits, leaned forward. "What of war, Master Skywalker? If war comes, what do your people do?" Luke did not say never because never was a superstition. He said, "We will defend what we must to protect life, but we will not be an army. We are healers, guardians, teachers. A weapon is a last resort." "And what is a first resort?" Iver asked with an eyebrow that wanted to be arched. "Listening," Luke said simply, "and eating together." A ripple of laughter broke the room's tension like surf on rock. Iver's mouth twitched. Mon Mothma's eyes glinted. Leia looked down to hide a smile. The charter passed, not by acclamation because nothing true passes that way, but by a margin honest enough to hold. Luke returned to the temple through a rain that streaked the air lanes and made the lights look like smeared paint. In the refectory, he ladled soup for an old woman from Borlia's and a boy with a sheaf of data cards under his arm. He had never been so tired. He had never been so alive. The first attack was not a charge of blasters up the steps, but a whisper in the dark underlevels. It began with a rumor that someone on level 1313 had woken a cache of battle droids and armed them for a ritual. The rumor smelled of rank water and burnt oil and devotional zeal. Acolytes, some called them the acolytes of the beyond. They loved Vader like a saint and the Empire like a lost cathedral with a bleeding altar. They stole relics and burned them and wore the ash. The rumor curled into the temple like a draft under a door. Luke followed it down. He went alone except for R2, who was as incapable of staying topside as a swallow is of ignoring open sky. They took a service lift whose walls were furred with old grease, and when it shuddered to a halt, the door opened into a tunnel whose air had the sweet rot of mushrooms and old coolant. Somewhere far off, a generator muttered to itself. R2 lit the way. Luke's boots slid on moss. At a junction, a thin blue figure detached itself from gloom. A service droid whose eyes had dimmed and whose arms hung wrong. Luke reached out with the Force and felt not hostility but drought. He put his hand on the droid's shoulder to steady it and murmured to it as if it could hear, because hearing often followed respect. The room with the droids was a shrine forged out of found parts. Somebody had hung a cracked transparisteel mask on a pipe and painted stars around it. Candles guttered in the low air, making the shadows move like anxious fish. 12B1 battle droids stood in a circle with their rifles trained inward, and at the circle's heart lay a square of cloth with a lightsaber hilt upon it. Ancient, warped, its kyber bled dry. A woman knelt before the cloth, head shaved, eyes fever-bright. "You can't have it," she said without looking up. "He's coming for it. And for you." Luke could feel the residue of the hilt. It had been wielded by a Jedi and taken by a hand that wanted to break what it could not become. "What's your name?" he asked. "Names are chains," she snapped. Names are counters on someone else's board. I like mine, Luke said gently. A pause. Ixen, she whispered, as if the syllables might bite her. Hello, Ixen, he said. Who taught you to be afraid of your own voice? She spat, not at him but at the floor. We learned fear from you, from your order. You came down in the night and took children and left war. Luke thought of Tala's grandmother sipping tea and of a clone trooper pausing for a small girl. I'm sorry, he said, and felt the words enter the air and sit with the flame smoke like a third thing in the room. We forgot to be kind and honest. We forgot to be ordinary. We will not forget again. Ixen's eyes glistened. She jerked her chin toward the hilt. We made a promise to him. Promises made in fear serve fear, he said. What if we made a promise here together that serves life and lets the dead rest? R2, who had rolled around behind the B-1S, warbled a query and then pulled a cable from his chassis to a wall port. The generator's hum modulated. Battle droid's green photoreceptors blinked uncertainly, then went dark, heads tilting as if to ask permission to sleep. Ixen made a soft sound of despair. You'll take it, she said. I'll bury it, Luke said. I'll bury it in a place where nothing ever finds it again. Not even me. She flinched. That's blasphemy. Some blasphemies are mercies. She looked at the mask on the pipe and saw, perhaps for the first time, that plastic is plastic even when it's been wept upon. Who are you to decide? Someone who has decided badly before, he said. Someone trying to decide better with you. They stood breathing the same poor air. Luke felt no victory rising in him, only a careful patience, a waiting for a tide. In that waiting, the light touch came again. A hand on a shoulder without weight and a companionate smile in the dark. Trust the now, Qui-Gon said. Trust the person in front of you. Help me, Luke said to Ixen softly. She looked at her hands. She looked at the droids who had been given sleep. She swallowed and nodded once, a tiny bow that broke something hard inside her. I don't know how. I do, Luke said. We can start with breakfast. She laughed then, the sound rusty and young. The ritual ended. The candles guttered out. R2 trilled a bright flourish, proud of his sabotage and happier still that sabotage had become a lullaby. Luke buried the hilt where he said he would. Not in the temple, not in the ground of Coruscant, but in a place of deep sea on a world that had never known empire, beneath swimming lights where fish moved like prayers. He said nothing aloud when he let it go. He thanked the dead in his heart, and the dead said nothing, which was the right answer. The temple's days lengthened. The kitchen taught a dozen teens to cook for crowds. The refectory became a complicated organism with its own moods. A garden began stubbornly on the upper terrace with pots of hardy seed gleaned from refugee hands. Luke taught in the morning and learned in the afternoons. He learned old forms from holocrons that had survived and new forms from children who didn't know you were supposed to be impressed. He spent time with Lor Santeca, who brought maps and stories like candies and argued gently about the nature of faith. Ahsoka came and did not come. She walked with him one day among the fountains when their water was shyly learning to leap again, and she said, "Don't call me master." And he said, "I won't." And then they laughed and shared bread. She said she would stand with him but not beneath any banner, and he said that was exactly how he liked his friends. Ben moved between classes and the city with a restless generosity. He made friends with Kessa by giving him a silly nickname and then letting him choose a sillier one in turn. He crushed training remotes with too much force and apologized to them afterward. He had a temper that flared and cooled quickly, like sun on a brief storm. Luke watched him and didn't try to prune the wildness. He had pruned too much in himself once and found not order but hollowness. He gave Ben language for what came and went. He gave him tasks that used his heat. He gave him a room with a window that looked at the busy sky. At night, when the wind skirled around the towers, Luke meditated on the terrace. He did not ask the Force for visions. He asked it to show him what was here. Some nights the answer was the warmth of the stones beneath him and the taste of rain in his mouth, and a cat from the next tower over that decided to put its paws on his knee and purr. Some nights the answer was colder. The voice was not a voice and he never caught it whole. It moved behind things, a shadow in the snow of an old transmission, a note almost too low to hear threaded beneath the skylane hum. It brought with it a feeling like pressure changing before a storm. It didn't knock. It seeped. He told no one at first. He didn't tell because naming a shadow makes it sharper, and because he wanted to be certain he was not making an old fear into a new superstition. The temple had ghosts, but they were not malicious. Echoes, reverences, sometimes warnings that were like a shifting in the body before a stumble on a stair. This was different. It was aware of being aware. It was hungry. He found traces of it in places it didn't belong. In the tremor of a senator's hand as she signed a bill that cut relief to a level that had no clean water. In a rumor that certain arms dealers were buying Kyber shards with an urgency that couldn't be explained by collector's lust. In Ben's face one afternoon when he stared too long at a holoscreen that streamed Old War footage and didn't blink. Luke touched his nephew's shoulder and the boy startled as if waking. He laughed it off and Luke laughed too, because laughter was the rope they threw to one another across slips. But that night he stood on the terrace until his feet grew numb and asked the Force what road the cold was on. The answer came in a dream that was not a dream but a visit. He was walking the old stacks and the lamps were all lit, and the smell of paper was high summer. He turned a corner and there he was, the tall figure with hair that couldn't decide if it wanted to be neat. Qui-Gon leaned against a shelf with the patience of a tree. "You look well," Luke said. "So do you," Qui-Gon said, which might have been true or might have been kindness. "You've chosen a difficult place to plant. That pleases me. There is something here that doesn't want planting," Luke said. He didn't hedge. Nothing was gained in hedging with a man who had always preferred a door kicked open to a door politely knocked upon. "I feel it. It feels you," Qui-Gon said, tolerant and unruffled. "Things like that do. They gather where power gathers, and you've made power gentle here. That irritates them the way a river irritates a drought. How do I fight something I can't see?" "You don't," Qui-Gon said, as if the notion were a small error with a simple correction. "You don't fight it. You stay so completely in the living force that you make its offer boring to everyone you love." Luke laughed despite himself. "Boring? Fear is fond of drama." Qui-Gon's smile was rueful. The drama of isolation, of being misunderstood, of one true vision against a dull world. Don't give it the stage. Serve, eat, sleep, teach, listen, love. Build rituals of kindness that are so ordinary the shadow can't find a seam. "I can do that," Luke said quietly. "I can try. And when what's inside someone you love aches toward the cold," Qui-Gon added, and for a moment his eyes were as stern as they were tender, "you will not make it about you." Luke closed his eyes and let the admonition enter and sink. "I promise." He kept the promise a dozen small ways in the weeks that followed. He kept it when Ben argued with Tala and stormed off and came back sheepishly with an apology half-formed. He kept it when Kessa's fear leapt up from an old well and made him shake at the top of the steps because the crowd looked like a cliff. He kept it when Leia's voice on a late-night comm sounded tired enough to crack and he didn't tell her to sleep but simply said, "I'm here," the way you say it to a person sitting at the edge of a bed in the dark. He made meals and mopped floors and hunted leaks with an old maintenance droid on the roof. He made the temple boring in the sense that a hearth is boring. Steady, warm, unfascinating, indispensable. They went to Ilum in late season. He had delayed it because he wanted the first Kybers gathered for the new sabers to be earned in the liturgy of common life, not the glamour of ice. But the day came and Tala and Kessa and Yassik and Ben were ready. Ahsoka said, "Take them," and Lor Santeca said, "Trust them," and Leia said, "Don't let my son fall down a crevasse." So Luke promised and smiled and took the four in a borrowed shuttle that still bore the sigil of a spice company. Ilum was wind like a blade. The cold bit any uncovered skin and the sky could not decide whether to be white or iron. They camped beneath a lee and the children's laughter made steam. Luke taught them to listen to the quiet inside the roar. He watched Tala stand with her head cocked, as if she'd heard her name called from far off. He watched Kessa put his hands on the snow and feel, through his palms, the old heartbeat of the planet. He watched Yassik close his eyes and simply breathe, and he loved the trust of that. He watched Ben grin at the others and then turn away, going still in a way that wasn't performance. The cave took them one by one. Luke waited in the arched ice like a father at a school gate, not intruding. They came out carrying crystals and something else, a way of standing that seemed to rethread the spine. Ben was last. He stepped into the light with his hair blown into black storm and a green shard in his palm bright as leaf. His face was luminous, and Luke recognized the look because he had worn it once himself in a hut on a swampy world where an old creature had laughed until tears made mud of his wrinkles. "It sang," Ben said, unable to keep from speaking. "It sang like noodles boiling but clean." Kessa laughed and Tala elbowed him and Yasik shook his head with exaggerated pity. Luke grinned. "The metaphors get better with age," he promised. On Ilum, in the night, the cold voice tried again. It came from neither north nor south but from a direction like under, and it wore no name. It was less a seduction than an insinuation, the suggestion that he could keep everyone safe if he tightened his circle a little smaller, tightened again, tightened until his arms were a noose. He sat up in his sleeping bag and watched Ben sprawl, one arm across his face, the crystal beneath his pillow like a heartbeat. He didn't try to chase the cold away. He opened his chest, breathed, and let the wind sing through him. At the cave mouth, beyond snow whirls, he thought he saw for an instant the outline of a tall man in a poncho and hair that refused obedience. Then it was only night and stars, which were enough. They returned to Coruscant through a sky as turbulent as river water in spring. The temple absorbed their noise and gave back calm. In the workshop, Luke taught them to build their sabers. Solder smelled like burnt fruit. Metal sang when it nested well. The first ignition lights were small suns nobody wanted to look away from. The attack, when it came, borrowed the shape of celebration because fear loves to wear the clothes of joy. It was Remembrance Day, a holiday the city had kept even when the Empire preferred memorials of another tint. The temple's doors were open from dawn, and a stream of citizens came to see the relit fountains and the archive's exhibition of old, harmless artifacts. Talas and Kessas from levels far below bent over displays. Wooden practice swords, a meditation bowl, a child's training mask, while docents told stories about ordinary heroism. Senators came and ate stew shoulder to shoulder with dockworkers and took off their shoes to walk in the shallow fountain that children adored. Luke was telling a story to a boy about how a Jedi once used the Force to stop a droid from stepping on a flower when the first scream didn't come. That was the genius of it. There was no first scream. There was a shiver in the air like a weather shift, and the crowd, which had moved randomly, began to move with a subtle direction. The pressure changed, the laughter thinned, and then the doors at the lower level detached themselves from their hinges. Figures stepped through the breach not in black. Because imitation is a form of worship they lacked confidence to own, but in dun coats that dissolved edges. Their masks were plain, almost featureless, the color of the city's dust. The leader carried a lightsaber that wasn't built so much as scavenged into existence. It bled light that flickered angrily, like a coal that refuses to wholly catch. He walked as if he liked to be watched. He called himself Ren. "Saints of the Broken Star," he said pleasantly through his mask voice. "Children of the Ash, behold the temple and its gentle lies." Ahsoka was on the terrace with Lor Santeca, and she was moving before the sentence finished. Leia, who had been speaking with Mon Mothma beneath an arch where ivy had finally taken hold, made for the children. Han appeared from nowhere, which was his way of being a husband and a friend, with luck like a homing bird. Ben was in the workshop with Kessa and Tala. Yasik had run down to the kitchen to fetch more bread. Luke stood between Rin and a crowd that didn't yet know if it was in panic. "We're open," Luke said, and it was almost funny because he meant the doors. "You didn't have to break anything to come inside." Rin bowed. "I prefer entrances that teach." "What are you teaching?" Luke asked, not to flatter but to offer a rope across a gap. Rin lifted his blade a little. "Grief," he said simply. "Your order brought war to this city. The Empire brought order. You bring chaos in the name of kindness. We will bring the peace of clarity." Behind him, the masked figures spread with practiced calm. Not a militia that had drilled in squares, but a cult that had rehearsed chaos. They began taking people by the shoulders, not roughly, just emphatically, turning them to face the empty space Ren had made at the center. Space that demanded a narrative. Luke's saber sprang into his palm with the familiarity of a friend's hand. He ignited it, and the green bloom cast the dust masks in a strange underwater light. He did not step forward. He felt Qui-Gon at his shoulder the way a wind sometimes stands companionably at your back. Boredom, he thought, with a sudden grin at the ridiculous blessing of that council. Make him boring. You want to be a villain, Luke said almost conversationally. That's so tidy. But today is remembrance. I'm going to tell a story instead. Ren paused, puzzled, then irritated. Master Skywalker. Once there was a boy on a farm, Luke said, his voice carrying because the temple had been built for voices to carry. He wanted to see the stars. He hated dust. He loved his aunt and uncle. He was rash and impatient and frightened. He thought a weapon would make him strong. He was wrong. It's the people around a weapon that decide whether it's a tool or a murder. The breath of the crowd changed, not all at once, but in little adjustments, like a school of fish turning. Leia's hand, invisible to most, had indicated to the guards where to stand without being obvious. Ahsoka moved along a balcony in shadow like a knife you haven't seen yet. Lore asked a child a question so quietly that the child stopped crying to hear.
Rein tuitit.
We're not here for stories. That's a pity, Luke said, because stories are how we make sense. If you came for pain, we have enough. It's a city. If you came for confession, I have one. I don't know everything. I'm going to burn the stew tonight. I lose my temper when I shouldn't. Sometimes I wish I could just tell everyone what to do and make them safe. And then I remember that safety without freedom is a mausoleum.
Rein longt.
The red blade came fast and low, glittering with instability. Luke met it and let it slide by, turning the motion into a drawn spiral that took energy away and gave it to stone. He stepped not forward but aside, refusing drama the straight line it desired. Ren pressed, his footwork hungry in a way that suggested he'd learned from Holos more than masters. Luke's response was light, angles cut lightly as breath. Around them, the crowd drew back and did not scream because screaming was a tool and a story and they had been given another one. Ben leapt from the workshop balcony like a meteor with sense. He landed hard, rolled, came up with his new saber unignited but in his hand like a promise. Kessa was right behind him, green blade humming, eyes big, breath careful. Tala reached for children and tucked them behind a bench like kittens. Ahsoka dropped into the center of the masked circle as if a hole in the air had opened to let her through. Her white blades flared, and where she moved there were afterimages. She didn't advance. She dismantled. She took weapons apart the way a musician breaks a chord into gentler notes. Ren snarled audibly then. He was losing the narrative. Luke felt the cold at last make its bid. He slipped toward Ben. Not toward Luke, because the cold wasn't stupid, but toward the boy who wanted to be brave and didn't yet know how to keep from mistaking thunder for music. It murmured to him in a voiceless suggestion. I will make you understood. I will make you necessary. He felt Ben's heat flare in answer, a matching like iron meeting magnet. Ben, Luke said calmly without looking at him. Ben's breath hitched.
I'm okay.
Good, Luke said. We have noodles later. He cracked something absurdly human open in the heat of battle. Kessa snorted a laugh he couldn't help. Tala rolled her eyes even as she herded more people behind shimmer shields. Han's barked cackle echoed from somewhere behind a column. Leia's very quiet exhale found Luke's ear from across 20 meters and was the exact size of relief. Ren overreached in his irritation and Luke let the momentum carry him past. Luke's blade flicked once, twice, and Ren's hilt spit and died with a petulant cough. The leader stumbled, not as dramatic as he'd planned to be. The cultists wavered because their focal point had become human. Sit, Luke said to Ren as if offering a chair. Something in the way he said it lodged. Ren sank half in daze to one knee, his mask tilted. For a moment, through the slits, eyes blinked that were not nights but days. Confused, a little embarrassed. He reached as if to tear the mask off, and then the cold slid under the gesture and stiffened his wrist. He stilled. Luke felt the pressure reach from elsewhere, like a hand through a glove. "No," Luke said aloud to the reaching thing, in the tone he had once used on a stubborn friend in a cockpit over a death machine. "Not today." He didn't narrow his focus. He widened it until the temple was within the bowl of his attention. The fountains singing, the kitchen heat making its way into cool corridors, Ahsoka's blades like gulls, Mon Mothma's clenched hand loosening at her side, Leia's steady eyes, Han's irreverent pulse, Tala's careful breathing, Kessa's feet planted, Yassik running with a tray of bread he'd refused to drop, Lore speaking to a terrified man about the taste of tea. He included everyone, the frightened and the brave, the malicious and the kind. He held the whole, and in that wholeness the cold had no seam. Ren's head dropped. The cultists began to move backward without quite deciding to. Ahsoka let her blades go dim and put them away in motions so practiced they looked like listening. Guards stepped in not to pounce but to shepherd. Leia was suddenly next to Mon Mothma, and their hands found each other, a little awkwardly, with the relief of women who had waded through too many disasters. Han said, "Kid noodles," as if they just finished a shift. Ben stood shaking, his crystals light steady though his breath wasn't. He looked at Luke and then at Ren and then beyond, into a space where the air might have been emptier than before. He took one step toward his uncle, then another, then he was there, and Luke put a hand on the back of his neck and felt the hot dampness of sweat and the staccato of relief. "You did very well," Luke said low. "You listened past the roar. I almost—" Ben began, and then stopped because the word didn't form a shape he wanted in the air. "You almost chose a story that wasn't yours," Luke said. "Boo." "You didn't." Ben pressed his face briefly into Luke's shoulder the way he had when he was 5 and a sandcrab had surprised him. Then he straightened and made his breath slow and looked at Kessa, who grinned, relieved that compliments were contagious. In the aftermath, there were broken stones and bruises and not enough tea. There were also 1,000 small hands helping and a dozen large ones who had once refused to help and now did. Leia and Mon Mothma stood before the press and said that the temple was a place of service and the attack had been an attack on that service. Not on mysticism, not on power, but on kitchens and clinics and fountains. The city was good at getting over things. It was also good at not forgetting. Ran, whose real name was something much gentler, sat in a cell that had no hard edges and looked at his hands. He removed the mask because a guard asked him if he'd like to. He cried for a long time. Luke visited him, not to interrogate but to ask whether he liked soup with spice or without. Ren said in a cracked voice that made him sound 14. Luke brought soup with too much spice and apologized for overdoing it, and Ren laughed through tears at the problem of too much. The cold didn't stop. It learned. It became subtler, a series of suggestions inside suggestions, a set of beautifully carved doors inside a palace of argument. Luke refused the palace and watered the garden. He taught a class on the ethics of maintenance. He led a group of younglings on a field trip to the transit hub to listen to trains arriving and leaving and to feel in their bodies the way timing could be harmony. He sent Ahsoka to the Rim with Tala to teach a school what to do when a warlord took medicine as tax. He asked Lore to write down the stories that most people thought were too plain to matter. He sent Kessa to learn from a mechanic with 3 fingers and more patience than any saint. He gave Ben chores that were both beneath him and exactly right for him. Cleaning filters, listening to grief, sweeping steps, coaxing a drone with a bent wing to fly again. He gave him space to fail and a world to return to. One night, when the wind was gentle and the sky lanes for once were a little thinner, Luke went to the terrace and found Qui-Gon there without dramatics, like a neighbor leaning on a railing. "You made him boring," Qui-Gon said by way of greeting, and his smile was not unproud. "I made him soup," Luke said. "Ben saved us. He decided not to be alone." "That's all it takes," Qui-Gon said. "Over and over and over." "There's something behind him," Luke said quietly. "Behind the cultists and the whispers. It's not done." "Nothing is done while there are living minds," Qui-Gon said. "You can stand in the river." You can't freeze it. Better to teach them to swim. Luke looked out at Coruscant, at the lights like spilled salt, at the pulsing living force rising like warm air from the towers. Yes, he said, swimming, and stew. The years that followed were not easy, and that was precisely why they were good. The temple became a place where very tired people came at the end of shifts and left with a little more air in their lungs. It became a place where children argued about the ethics of repairing a droid that didn't want to be repaired and then repaired it anyway because it turned out the droid did want help. It just wanted to be asked. It became a place where senators came privately to ask how to grieve without turning grief into fuel, and where piloting students came publicly to ask how to thread lanes with less fear. The Hall of Fountains sang. The archives hummed. Sometimes, when the air was still, you could hear someone practicing scales on an old borrowed flute, and a passerby would stop in the doorway, smile, and keep walking. Ben grew. He fought with his mother exactly as needed and with his father in a way that ended in laughter more often than not. He learned to bow to Ahsoka without exaggeration and to accept that Kessa would always beat him in a certain drills game because Kessa's feet were smarter. He traveled off-world with Tala and returned sunburned and full of stories about children who had decided a tyrant was boring and a cooperative was interesting. He still had days when the cold whispered too close and his hands shook and his jaw ached from clenching. On those days, he sanded the banisters on the upper level because the rhythm steadied him. Sometimes he sat with Luke on the terrace and said nothing and received nothing but company and stars. There were other attacks, and some of them hurt more, and some of them came with names and uniforms and budgets because power hates to be dissolved by soup. There were times when Luke stayed awake through a night with a wounded guard and times when he missed seeing a hurt until it had grown harder to heal. There were moments when he wanted to reach for command as if for medication and when he did not do so because he remembered a hand on his shoulder without weight. The New Republic did what it always did. It moved forward and sideways and occasionally stumbled. Senator Yver brought him legislation 1 year that would have sequestered younglings in a manner that made Luke's teeth ache. Luke invited Yver to spend a week at the temple. Yver came only to show that he wasn't afraid. He left carrying an old book of his grandmother's recipes, a gift from Tala's grandmother, and he never introduced that legislation again. Mon Mothma left government with a grace that broke hearts and planted a garden on a little terrace of her own where she grew herbs for the kitchen. Leia stayed and then stepped back when she had to, and returned when she could, and was loved either way. Luke didn't become a legend. That was the point. He became a neighbor you could borrow a ladder from, and a teacher you could argue with, and a man you could ask to bless a child's first saber with a smile and a tear as if it were a birth, which it was. He became the person you saw sweeping steps in the morning, humming something you almost recognized. When you stood near the temple in the evening, when the air smelled of stone and steam and spice, when the sky lanes blurred into threads and the stars pricked holes in the dome of soot, you could feel the way the city breathed easier. The cold still breathed too, from its own far rooms, and sometimes it sought Coruscant with a focused malice. But the city had learned another story, and it told it to itself day after day. We eat together, we listen, we mend what is mended, we bury what must be buried, we let the fountains sing. The Jedi on Coruscant were not a tower above the people. They were people, which is harder and purer and always enough. One night, long after remembrance and after another riot and a peace and a vote and 1,000 bowls washed, Luke woke to the particular quiet that meant someone had come who never needed a door. He went to the Hall of Fountains. The water shone like hammered metal in the moonlight. There, on a bench a little damp from the mist, sat a man with a beard that had been both tidy and not in its time. Obi-Wan looked tired in the way the very happy do when they realize that rest is no longer a duty. "You did it," Obi-Wan said softly. "I'm doing it," Luke said. "We're doing it." Obi-Wan nodded. "That's better." "Thank you," Luke said. "For what?" Obi-Wan asked, perfectly serious. "For failing where I needed to see failure and for loving where I needed to see love," Luke said, and Obi-Wan laughed. Not at Luke, but with something that felt like the Force punctuating a sentence. "You sound like him," Obi-Wan said, meaning Qui-Gon. "I hope so," Luke said. Obi-Wan looked around the hall at basins that had finally learned their songs again. He would have liked this. All of this. "I know," Luke said. He told me. When Obi-Wan faded, as he always would and should, Luke remained. He listened to the water. He heard children laughing in a dream a level above, and a droid singing to itself as it cleaned, and a widow telling her hands to be steady as she prepared herbs, and Ben snoring in a way that suggested the day had taken him wholly and returned him like a tide returns a shell to shore. He put his palm on the stone and felt it warm beneath his skin as if the temple had a body and a pulse. The living force hummed and breathed and moved. It was full of sorrow and riot and stew and laughter and voting and broken doors and mended ones, and if the cold pressed its face to the glass now and again, it sighed and turned away because there was nothing to be done about a story whose ending kept being written at long tables with chipped bowls and clean spoons. On Coruscant, the fountains sang, and people walked past them on their worst days and their best, and the Jedi who lived among them learned every morning the hard, simple, beautiful lesson of being present. And when they faltered, they were caught not by a myth but by one another. And when they were asked who taught them, they named a dozen cooks and 2 plumbers and a woman on level 1325 who had shown them how to listen to a leaky pipe without anger, and once in a while they named a ghost who came like rain. Morning eased into the temple like a tide that didn't ask permission. Steam rose from the kitchen vents and curled across the upper terrace, and the scent of steeping herbs slipped under doors the way kindness does when you've forgotten to bar it. Luke woke before the sky lanes filled and walked the colonnade barefoot to feel the stones cool with his soles. The hall of fountains whispered to itself. On a bench by the nearest basin, Yassic slept with his head on a folded cloak, one hand still curved around a spoon as if he'd fallen into a dream between servings. R2-D2 found him and chirped softly, as if the dawn had a volume control. Luke sat beside the little droid and let the living force come forward. It did what it always did when he didn't try to grip it. It became everything. The rattle of a far tram, the cough of a workman starting a heat unit, the murmur of a couple whispering and deciding not to fight before breakfast, the delicate clink of a cup as Tala's grandmother set it down and then picked it up again because it was warmer than her hands. In that fullness, something thinner moved. The cold Luke had learned to notice without dramatics. It didn't press. It listened. He let it. He didn't invite it closer and he didn't send it away. He would be an ocean. It could be a chip of ice that melted or didn't, its choice. Ben arrived, hair sticking up from sleep, tunic askew. The green line of his saber hilt a fresh habit at his belt. He eyed the water as if it might speak a joke he hadn't heard yet and then dropped onto the stone with a sigh. I had the dream again, he said without preface. Not the big one, the noodles one. The noodles one is the most important, Luke said.
Ben Schmierked.
You always say that, and I always mean it. What did the noodles say this time? They didn't say anything, Ben admitted. They just steamed, and I knew it was okay to wait. Luke kept his face still, because if you praised a patient moment it tried to get up and turn theatrical. Good, he said, as if Ben had told him he'd tied his boots. Help me wake Yassic without waking his worry. They did it the way they did everything now. Gently, with humor. Ben breathed once the way Luke had taught him, the kind of breath that loosens knots in the body you didn't know you had. Yassic blinked up at them, smiled sleepily, and then sat bolt upright as if remembering 20 tasks at once. Stew? He muttered, groping for the pot that wasn't there. Stew can wait for stew, Luke said. Come run the roof. The roof run began as exercise and had become a devotion. They sprinted the perimeter path among antennae and vents, dodging the slow-rolling maintenance droid who believed himself a boulder in a stream, stopping at each corner to breathe and send that breath outward to the city that held them up. On the southeast corner, where the sun framed the Senate district in pale fire, Ben slowed without being told and looked at the lanes. He had learned to see the rhythms behind their apparent chaos, to feel when timing went smooth or went jagged. His eyes narrowed. See it? Luke asked.
Ben noided.
Lane K-43. Someone's flying mean. They watched the tiny point of a skiff jink where jinking made no sense, cutting other pilots' margins. Luke put his palm on the rail. The skiff's fuss leaked into his hand. A pilot vibrating with old fear pretending it was new freedom. He didn't reach out with command. He put the steady in his own pulse and let that pulse be in the air. The skiff's jitter softened, then softened again. The pilot's breath, because everyone breathed somewhere, found the same beat. The lane smoothed. Ben exhaled without knowing he'd been holding the air. "It's never just them," Ben said quietly. "It's never just us," Luke said. In the kitchen, the first shift hummed. Tala chopped roots with an attention that made each slice sound like music. Kessa stirred a vat, eyes half closed, reading the reach of the heat with the same part of him that read the air on the terrace. Ahsoka came in carrying a bundle of leafy herbs and a grin that said she'd stolen them from her own balcony garden and wanted to be caught. Leia arrived with Mon Mothma not long after, their conversation a murmur of numbers and names that grew warmer when they crossed the threshold. "Your kitchen saves my budget," Mon said, "with the kind of thanks you give more than once because you mean it fresh each time." "Your budget saves our roof," Luke answered, "because roofs didn't mend themselves, not even in a temple." They ate standing around a battered prep table, passing spoons, Ahsoka teasing Ben about a scorch mark on his sleeve. "Losing to a training remote, huh?" And Ben protesting that he'd been distracting Tala from a mistake she hadn't made. Mon wrinkled her nose in mock suspicion and said the stew needed more laughter. Leia obliged by making a joke about senators and spoons that caused Kessa to spill a ladle and Luke to hand over clean cloths while trying and failing not to smile. Later, when the kitchen shifted to second gear and the temple opened its doors to the morning, Lor San Tekka came in with a wind-scoured face and a satchel that clinked. "Maps," he said as if apologizing, "and a story about a singing stone on a moon none of us can afford to visit. Put the stone where it can make our leeks sing," Luke said, "and the maps where the children will spill broth on them. That way they'll remember." Lor laughed and bowed to the children who didn't think of themselves as children when they stood near the archives. He showed Tala a map of old hyperspace byways and told Kessa about a monastery of caretakers on an island world who believed knowledge was a kind of weather you could tend. Luke heard the word island and felt a tug toward a place he hadn't seen and didn't need to. Not yet. Not unless the living force insisted. He let the tug be a tug and not a command. Midday brought a delegation from 3 labor guilds on level 1313. They came wary, shoulders high in the way that meant you expected to be told the house wasn't for you. Luke met them at the lower doors and walked with them through the vestibule without speeches. He led them to the Hall of Fountains and sat on the floor next to the basin like a person plain as they. Ahsoka joined him cross-legged. Ben fetched cups of tea. "We want to talk about the strikes," the tallest guild rep said, gaze flicking over the water as if calculating whether it was a waste or a symbol worth stealing. "You've got the Chancellor's ear and half the press eating your stew." "We have ears," Luke said. "The Chancellor has her own." The man snorted despite himself. "Fair." They talked for a long time. They talked about wages and hours and a slipshod safety protocol that killed one worker a month on days when the supervisors were distracted. They talked about a security force that had begun to rough people up because uniforms were bored. They talked about the way hope dried on the tongue when you said the same sentence for 10 years. The cold hovered, curious. It liked the flavor of old bitterness. Luke didn't sweeten the bitterness. He asked where the cuts happened, and who made them, and what could be done that wasn't a dramatic story but might be an effective one. Ahsoka asked who the supervisor's mother was and whether she preferred tea or broth. And the guild reps cursed and laughed because it mattered and they were annoyed that it did. "We'll come down," Luke said at last. "Not with banners. With buckets and a repair kit. We'll fix 3 things you tell us to fix and show the press those things. You bring the press to the places where those things break. Then we keep doing it until the story isn't that the temple fixed something but that everyone knows the name of the person who kept breaking it." The tall rep stared at him. "That's slow." "It's what works when you're living next door," Ahsoka said. They left with less stiffness in their shoulders and a list of broken walkways and vents and a public address feed that crackled so badly it made children cry. Ben watched them go, thumbs hooked in his belt, face skeptical and hopeful all at once. "Buckets," he said. "Buckets," Luke agreed. In the afternoon, as the temple emptied and filled again like a lung, Senator Lon Iver appeared in the archway with the exact number of aides you bring to look serious and not combative. He wore a collar that fit better than it had months ago. Someone had found him a tailor who knew pride without stiffness. His eyes were watchful without the old flinch. "I've brought the oversight draft," he said, almost sheepish. "Not the one I threatened to write. The one I wrote after your stew made me apologize to my grandmother in my head." "Tea?" Luke asked, as if that were an answer. It was. They read the draft in a side room with a view of traffic. It was not flattering. It was not hostile. It asked that the temple keep its budgets in sunlight and its admissions transparent, that it accept audits of its kitchens and its clinics and submit reports on any use of force in disputes that involve the law. Luke nodded and asked for a clause of his own, that the auditors volunteer 1 day a month in the refectory and 1 day in a school on a lower level. Evere blinked. "That's not." "It is," Luke said. "Oversight isn't a throne. It's a hose." Evere stared, then snorted, then laughed out loud. He made a note. "I'll get ready to argue for the hose." "I'll send Stu," Luke said. Ben listened through the thin door with the frankness of the untrained and winced at his own eavesdropping. Ahsoka caught him, shook her head, and pulled him by the sleeve onto the terrace. "You want to do something hard?" she asked. "Always," he lied. "Come with me to the works," she said. "They're saying there's a resonance there that's making kids sick. We'll listen to it and not be fooled." The works had always sounded like an animal in pain. Towers there groaned and sighed and clanked with old machinery the way old war veterans do when they sit down. Ahsoka walked through the noise like a person used to making the city her second skin. Ben walked at her shoulder and tried not to let the anger rise that loved to rise when he saw children coughing because someone had cut a filter. They found the resonance under an arch that no one had painted since an empire fell. It was a note so low it made teeth ache. Kids stood near it as if hypnotized and then left with their eyes too wide. A woman with a scar over her eye and a stubborn mouth met them with suspicion. "Your temple," she said. "Some of us are plumbers," Ahsoka said, which was almost true. Ben knelt and put his ear to the stone. The note slid under his skull and tugged. It wanted to frame itself as prophecy. It wanted to say, "You are needed, you alone, you and your anger will fix what they cannot." He recognized the script because he'd seen it dramatized behind Ren's mask. "It's a broken harmonic," he said, his voice flat to keep the drama from hearing. "A cycling unit 2 blocks over is throwing the line out of phase." "You sure?" the woman asked, not like a challenge but like a mother who'd be relieved to be told the monster is the wind. "Let me be wrong," Ben said, and let her see that his pride wouldn't break if it was. Ahsoka sent him with 2 kids who knew the maze. She went the other direction with the woman and a wrench that had outlived 3 owners. They found the unit and it was, in fact, out of phase, a cheap part vibrating against a bracket with the precise cruelty of something badly designed. Ben knocked it gently with the heel of his hand and it stopped. He tightened the bracket. The note under the arch back the other way fell away like a fever. "You hear that?" the woman said, and Ahsoka smiled like a quiet sunrise while Ben tried not to grin too much and failed. On the way back to the temple, the cold pressed lightly against Ben's thoughts the way fog leans on glass. It promised him a blaze of significance if he kept listening to certain kinds of sound. He rolled his shoulders and remembered noodles steaming, silence being enough. He cut down an alley solely because it didn't look like a prophecy. Ahsoka, beside him, didn't look over. She didn't need to. Night brought rain. The city went glossy. In the archives, Luke and Lor Santeca compared notes on island monasteries. "They called themselves caretakers," Lor said, delighted by the word. "They believed knowledge needed floors swept and roofs patched the same as bodies." "I like them already," Luke said. He traced a line on an old map with the pad of his finger. He felt the pull again, the way a tide might draw you toward a cove where a certain key fit a certain door. He knew the story in which a master goes away to learn alone and returns legendary. He didn't like that story anymore. "Let's invite them here," he said impulsively. "Or send someone who's good at floors." "Send yourself," Lor suggested, half teasing, half earnest. "Not yet," Luke said. "The gardens need hands." An IO level 13-13-3 repaired vents and a broadcast that doesn't make toddlers cry. He kept those promises. Ben kept running the roof. Ahsoka kept teaching without calling it teaching. Leia kept the Senate from swallowing its tongue. And Han kept appearing at Luke's elbow with exactly the right irreverence. Chewbacca took to arriving on quiet days with a crate of Hydra spanners and an unspoken list of things the temple hadn't realized it needed to fix. C-3PO tried to help and ended up giving a lecture on historical architraves to a group of children who applauded because they'd been taught to. R2 stayed R2 and saved 3 lives with a jolt of voltage no one else would have thought to apply. The cold, deprived of spectacles, sent subtler emissaries. A rumor began among the acolytes that the temple was hoarding Kyber and that the old vaults hid a cache of blades used to enforce obedience. Another rumor said the fountain's water was drugged to make citizens placid. A third suggested that Leia had placed her son at the temple to ensure an aristocracy of force would replace a senate. The rumors wore different masks but the same mouth. Luke answered none of them directly. He opened more doors. He let the children from the works lead tours and say, with the authority of small experts, "This is where we keep the spoons. There is no drug. We tried." He let Ixen, the acolyte who had knelt in a room of dead droids, choose a section of the archive to catalog and watched as her hands learned to touch history without trembling. He asked the Holonet reporters to help plant beans and told them they could keep their coats clean if they wanted to. The cold grew impatient. It pricked in a way that made neck hair lift. It finally showed a bit of spine in a message sent along an old Imperial relay, a packet of code that wasn't a threat but a question. How much weight could the temple bear before it cracked into legend? The question arrived as a glitch in the broadcast feed on level 1313. The image jumped. The sound distorted. A shape flickered, stretched, resolved into a robed figure only as long as it took a mind to say, "Important." Then nothing. Luke refused the stage. He gathered the children who ran the feed into the temple's side room and taught them what R2 taught him when systems misbehaved. They wrote a script that turned glitches into jokes. When the figure flickered next time, a cartoon spoon appeared next to it saying, in a variety of languages, "Stir, don't stew." The kids laughed until they fell over. The figure didn't return. The relay went quiet. The Knights of Ren, or the handful who had survived their own sense of theater after the temple's boring, tested the doors again months later, not with a charge but with a theft. They stole stories. Archivists reported that certain holocrons flickered and when they returned, they'd been trimmed. A lesson excised here, a caveat there, the gentle parts snipped out and the hard parts sharpened. Tala noticed that a set of children's books about a Jedi who mended fences now contained twice the number of duels and half the number of conversations about why neighbors disagreed. Luke sat with the hacked holocrons and thought. He could lock the vaults tighter. He could call it defilement and rage. He didn't. He put a table in the hall with a sign, hand-lettered by Ben because Ben's lettering was chaos and therefore inviting, that read, "Broken stories, bring yours." People came with discs and chips and books with bent spines. They put them on the table and told the archivists how they'd known something wasn't right. Luke sat for hours every evening at that table and listened. He didn't ask leading questions. He laughed when someone needed the laugh to land safely. He cried when a widow described a battle retold as prophecy when it had been only terror and smoke. Repairing the stories became a ceremony. Ahsoka devised an exercise. You sat across from another person and told them the piece of the story that made you ashamed. Then you told them what you loved and feared you didn't deserve. Then you put the two together and pinned them with a sentence that said, "Both can be true and neither has to be forever." The holocrons hummed as if relieved to be told they didn't have to be smooth. Ben took to the repairs with a ferocity that surprised him. He had always loved stories where someone swung a blade at the right angle in the right moment and cut a knot clean. Now he learned to savor the ones where the knot was picked with dirty fingernails over tea. He sat with Ixen one evening and listened as she spoke softly about the mask on the pipe and how sacred it had felt to be seen by something that didn't ask her to be human. He didn't say, "That's wrong." He said, "I know the ache." He told her the noodle's dream. She laughed so hard she cried and then cried so hard she laughed. The temple's reputation as a center for ordinary heroism spread until it became a joke the way blessings do when they're healthy. People said, "I tripped on the steps, I guess I'm a hero now." And the person next to them said, "You are," and both meant it more than they let on. Senators began to come not to be seen but to disappear for an hour into work that made bodies sweat and sharpened minds. The ailing came and rested. The angry came and cleaned. Children came and remembered to be children in a world that tried to sell them drama. The Knights of Ren tried twice more to make a blood spectacle and found themselves gently folded like laundry into a process of accountability that denied them martyrdom and gave them work. The cold did not vanish. It had old roots and fine patience. It found new soils, far-rim worlds where the new Republic's hand was slow or clumsy, ships in the black where captains turned fear into law, academies that wanted to teach certainty because uncertainty made donors nervous. It sent agents not in masks but in manners. A financier whose smile asked you to sign away the right to doubt. A populist with a gift for making the complex sound like a conspiracy. A teacher who insisted there was only one way to feel the Force and that way could be bought. One such agent arrived on Coruscant in the fall of a year that had seen more rain than usual. She called herself Mother Den and ran a charity for sensitive youths. She recruited deftly, with the right phrases and enough paperwork to look legitimate. She offered families stipends and children uniforms and a sense of being special without the trouble of being useful. Her building was clean in the way of rooms no one is allowed to live in. Luke visited once, unannounced, walked the corridors and listened to the way his breath sounded in them. It sounded like an echo in a cylinder. Mother Den met him with hands extended and a gaze that dared him to be skeptical in public. Her followers stood behind her, impeccable. She had a way of praising the temple that made refusal sound churlish and acceptance sound like surrender. "We'd love to collaborate," she said. "Structure, Master Skywalker. Rhythm. The city is noise. Children need a drum. Children need a kitchen," Luke said pleasantly. "And someone who lets them burn a batch of bread." She smiled with her teeth, tiny and white. "You mistake permissiveness for kindness. The old order did that. Look where it led the galaxy." "It led me here," Luke said, and angled his body so he could see the door and the street and a scrap of sky. "And here is good." She invited him to speak at her school. He brought a bag of spoons and bowls. He set them on the floor of her pristine auditorium and let the children make noise. He told them the story of the farm boy and the flower he'd once saved from a droid's foot. He said nothing about light or dark. He asked the kids to teach him their favorite games. Mother Den smiled like a wolf politely leaving the sheep because the shepherd was armed. The next week, 2 of Mother Den's aides came to the temple with forms that would streamline the process by which sensitives were placed in appropriate environments. The forms were efficient, tight-mouthed, gleaming. Leia arrived in the hall by a coincidence with old experience behind it. She read the forms, face impassive. She handed them back. "No," she said. "This is for the good of the city," the aide said sharply. "Safety. Consistency. The good of the city," Leia said so softly it hurt, "is the good of my son's laugh, and the laughter of children who aren't my son. We do not sort laughter by column." Mother Den's organization folded slowly, not because Luke fought her in the press or because the Senate banned her. In a city of this size, bans are invitations, but because the temple made her unnecessary. Families who had signed her forms unsigned them when they smelled stew and saw Kessa kneel to speak to a small boy. Ahsoka visited her auditorium and taught the caretakers there how to listen not for a single note but for a chord. Mon Mothma invited Mother Den to dinner and asked her what she was afraid would happen if a child made a mess. Mother Den did not cry in public. She faded without witnesses. Ben kept learning that nothing interesting happened fast. The great exception was the day he fell in love, and even that had been fermenting in a corner of his heart for a year. She wasn't a Jedi. She fixed transit gates with fingers stained a honest blue. She called him loud when he was and rolled her eyes when he pretended not to be. She came to the temple to borrow a wrench and left without returning it because she needed it more. He realized one evening, while sweeping the upper steps and complaining to Tala about grit, that he wanted to know whether this girl liked noodles spicy or not. He laughed out loud at himself and Tala laughed with him, and he felt the cold glare and turn away because falling in love left nothing for it to stick to. He told Luke the next morning on the roof in a rush that collided with itself. Luke listened and smiled and didn't tell a story. He asked 3 questions. Do you breathe easier near her? Can she laugh at you without cruelty? Does she prefer tea or broth? Ben said yes, tea, and Luke said, bring her to dinner without the temple making a show of it. Ben did. She ate 2 bowls and argued with Leia about transit funding in a way that made Leia grin and Han beam and Chewbacca grunt approval. R2 played them a song he claimed to have composed himself, and C-3PO corrected him 3 times before conceding the point. The cold came up to the door, listened to the laughter, and went away. It was possible to forget, in such seasons, that the galaxy could change direction in a day. Luke had learned not to forget. The word arrived not as a broadcast or a scream, but as a knock at a service door that hardly anyone used. A boy stood there in a coat too thin for the wet. He said a name to R2 that made the droid spin twice and call for Luke with a tone reserved for emergencies and surprise birthdays. The name was Lor Santeca. He had gone following a map to a world that wasn't on the maps yet. A world of red sand and rock pillars that sang when wind touched them. He found there a cult not unlike the Acolytes and not quite the same, whose leader called himself the Listener and wore no mask. The Listener didn't worship Vader or the Empire. He worshipped attention. He gathered it with stories that felt like secrets. He borrowed techniques from teachers and thieves and Holonet stars. He persuaded a distant governor to embargo medicine to a moon and then sold the moon a cure. He convinced tired systems to choose a strong hand and then asked that hand to sign a pledge to efficiency that erased names. He spoke in a voice that reminded you of a parent you loved if you were lonely and of a teacher you hated if you were proud. Lor had left the world after a week of listening. The boy had come with him to carry his satchel and then had run when he heard the Listener ask for him by name. Names were chains, Ixon had said once. Names were connections, Luke had learned. They could become chains or they could be threads. He took the boy's trembling hands between his own and said, "You're safe to be called here." Lor arrived the next day, dried by travel, eyes sharper than tired. He sat with Luke and Ahsoka and Leia, and because fate liked a laugh, Han, who had come to borrow a tool which was how all important meetings should be attended, and laid out what he had seen. "It's the same cold," he said, "wearing a new coat. He doesn't care which story you use as long as it puts him in the center. He's building a lattice, not an army, a habit." "How far?" Leia asked. "Farther than we'd like," Lor said, "but not beyond noodles."
Han grinned.
"My kind of strategy." Luke felt Qui-Gon come stand where he stood, not to instruct but to accompany. He thought of the old story in which a master went to confront the head of a cult and cut him down in a clean line, and he thought of the newer story in which a group of neighbors made soup. He thought of the voice in the works and the broken harmonic. He thought of Ben's laugh and the way the city's breath changed when scripts were rewritten by hand. "I'll go," he said, "but not to fight a duel." Ahsoka lifted a brow. "To fix a bracket?" "To teach," Luke said simply. "To listen in public. To make him boring." Leia shut her eyes and opened them again. "The way you do when you bless and curse the same person." "Take Ahsoka." Ahsoka nodded. "I was already putting my cloak on." "Take Ben," Han said, and Leia opened her mouth to argue and then closed it because she knew the shape of Ben's days and the way a test avoided can become an exam. "Take Ben," she said, slow and certain. "And take noodles." They went in a freighter that used to smell of spice and now smelled of clean. Ben stood at the viewport and tried to name each star he passed. A habit Luke had taught him to keep fear from writing its own captions. Ahsoka told a story about a mission in a war that had eaten wars and how she had once disarmed a man by asking him whether he slept well. Lor dozed in his chair with his mouth open in the dignity of old men who know they don't need to keep performing. The red world was red enough to make cheeks flush. The pillars did sing. The Listener's compound sat in a ring of stones and weather vanes. People lined up in the courtyard to receive assignments that sounded like honors and were chores, rewards that felt like achievements and were privileges with interest payments. The Listener came out at noon to speak. He looked less like a villain than like a teacher who was very organized and very tired of improvisation. He saw Luke and smiled as if made glad by company and irritated by competition. "Master Skywalker," he said warmly, "welcome. We've been expecting you." "I try to be predictable," Luke said. The listener gestured to the platform. "Join me." Luke shook his head. "I'll stand with them." He stood with the line, between a woman whose hands shook and a man who didn't blink. Ahsoka moved to the other side of the yard. Ben stood near the pillars, feeling their songs. Lore walked the perimeter as if reading a text written by wind. The listener spoke about clarity. He spoke about structures that would keep people from falling into chaos. He spoke about efficiency and excellence and the way special children needed frames. He spoke with the cadence of a man who remembered being small and frightened and had read books that said he could become large and unafraid if he softened all edges into a plan. He did not mention the taxes on medicine or the names erased. He did not need to. The plan was the apology. Luke didn't interrupt. He waited until the plan reached its applause point. He didn't applaud. He put up his hand like a student. "Yes," the listener said, magnanimous. "What do you do when a child breaks your plan?" Luke asked. The listener smiled, benevolent. "We teach them to love the plan. And when they don't," Luke said, quite mild, "then they are not ready." Luke nodded as if that were an answer to something. "Would you like to eat with us?" The listener blinked. "Eat? We brought noodles," Luke said. "Spicy and not." The laugh that ran through the courtyard was not disrespectful. It was relief. Ahsoka was unpacking pots before anyone had said yes. Ben struck a heat unit with that little flourish of the Force that lit things efficiently without showing off. Lore found bowls. The line shifted, then shifted more, like a school of fish finding a new current and relaxing into it because it was truer to the water. The listener hesitated only a second before stepping down. He wasn't stupid. He knew theater. He took a bowl. He ate with grace. He told a story about his mother and stew that almost made Luke like him despite everything. Luke told a story about a cracked bracket and a headache that turned out to be a note too low for ears. Ahsoka laughed with a woman who had forgotten how loud she could be. "Will you teach here?" the listener asked finally, as if conceding a point and staking out another. "We will listen," Luke said. "We will fix WH. You point at. We will call broken things broken and mended things mended. We won't sign anything that erases a name." The listener's eyes shadowed. "Names are chains. Names are how we ask a person to dinner," Luke said. "We can eat without them. It's lonelier." Something shifted in the courtyard. The cold pressed and failed to find a seam. Ben felt the pillar's song change key. He realized the sound had been slightly out of tune and now was less so. The man who didn't blink blinked. The woman whose hands shook set her bowl down without clatter. The listener understood stories too well not to feel his slipping. He reached then for drama the way you do when you're losing patient attention. He lifted his hand, not fast but theatrical, and a ring on his finger, carved with a sigil that looked like a spiral trying not to be a knot, glinted. Power gathered, cold, intimate, focused, the kind of power that takes consent and replaces it with a clean room. Ben felt it aim at Luke with a precision that believed in itself too much. "Hey," Ben said, with the careful disrespect Luke had taught him to use only when it would unfurl tension instead of knot it. "You ever had noodles with sweet salt?" The listener blinked. The ring faltered. It took years of training to ignore a question about food when you were hungry. He glanced at Ben, and in that glance fell out of rhythm with the force he'd gathered. Ahsoka moved without moving. Not a leap, a breath. The ring cracked with a tiny sound like a seed husk opening. The power dispersed the way water disperses when a child runs through it, laughing. Luke didn't take advantage. He didn't leap. He looked, with real pity, at a man who had built a plan to keep pain from touching him and then discovered that pain is a better teacher than plans. "Eat with us," he said again, and meant it both as invitation and defeat. The listener ate. He didn't surrender in a moment. No one ever surrenders in a moment that matters. He held on to corners of himself for days and weeks and months, and sometimes he found a way to rebuild a small rule and make it into a wall. People left him anyway, one by one and then in groups, because the noodles tasted better than the ring and the temple didn't ask them to be special to be welcome. He moved on eventually to a system where the wind sang in a different key. The cold went with him, patient and disappointed and always certain it would try again. Luke and Ahsoka and Ben and Lore returned to Coruscant with recipes and a cracked ring wrapped in cloth. They buried the ring where it couldn't teach anyone to despise their own breath. They wrote down the recipes and hung them on a wall where anyone could copy them. Ben told Leia about the pillars and Han about the way a question can break a spell, and Leia kissed his cheek and Han said, "Noodles save lives," in a way that made it a doctrine. Mon Mothma asked for the listener's name. Luke told her, and she wrote it on a list of people to be fed when they were hungry and opposed when they were cruel. Years folded over the temple like blankets and like seasons. Gardens grew where stone had been the only thing anyone expected. Children who had broken bowls later balanced ledgers. Old men who had once worshipped masks took shifts repairing rails so toddlers wouldn't fall. Ixon married a woman with a laugh so loud it healed a block of rooms and had a child who chewed on holocrons and left them brighter. Kessa became the patient person other people borrowed patience from. Tala taught a class on bending without breaking and wrote, in chalk on a wall, that bending only works when you know what you're bending toward. Yassic ran the kitchen and cursed like a saint until the day he became one without knowing. Ben stood up in front of a group of younglings and told them the noodle story and the pillar story and the story about the time he tried to show off with a training remote and scorched his sleeve and then apologized to the remote. He told them about being in love without telling them who, and a small boy sighed so loudly the room laughed, and Ben bowed to the boy as if he'd asked a stellar question. On some nights, Ben dreamed dark and woke shaking and walked to the terrace and found Luke or found the old maintenance droid or found a stray cat who looked bored and they sat together until breath returned. He did not become a legend. He became a man you could ask for a wrench. The Knights of Ren finally came one last time, not out of hope but out of habit. They arrived in rain and masks and were met not by a line of blades but by benches and bowls. Ahsoka leaned in the doorway with her arms folded. Leia stood with Mon and Han at the top of the steps. Luke sat on a low wall as if he'd been expecting a delivery. Ben waited on the terrace with Kessa and Tala and a dozen younglings whose sabers were lit only because the rain was beautiful on them. Ren, who had once knelt and almost taken off his mask, came slow. He didn't posture. He looked like a man who had run out of stories that made him look tall. He set his weapon down without looking at it. "I want to be bored," he said. Luke's chest hurt in the precise way it does when something broken lines up. "Good," he said. "We have floors that need sweeping." They put Ren in a room with a window and a broom and a man named Yassic who shouted at him when he did it wrong and fed him when he did it right, which is to say, as a human. The mask went on a shelf in the archives beside the cracked ring and a plaque that said, "Things that once made us forget ourselves." Iver came and read the plaque and didn't pretend the words weren't for him too. Lor Santeca wrote a book with chapters on spoons and brackets and pillars and did not mention heroes by name except when he wrote their names at the ends of chapters under the heading, "People who brought bread." One night, when the fountains sang louder than usual for reasons that couldn't be traced to pressure, Luke walked the halls barefoot and came upon Ben at the saber tree statue. The young man, no longer a boy, had his hand on the carved bark. His face wore a look that made Luke stop, the way you stop when you see the ending of one road and the opening of another. "I'm going to the rim," Ben said softly before Luke could ask. Luke nodded. "With Ahsoka?" "With anyone who wants to fix brackets," Ben said. "And to listen. The pillars aren't all on that red world." "They aren't," Luke agreed. "I'm scared," Ben said. "Not of the cold. Of being away from Stu. From all of you. You'll take the story with you," Luke said. "And you'll hear it said back to you in words we don't have yet." Ben laughed, then didn't. "You'll still be here?" "I'll be here as long as I'm here," Luke said, which was both evasive and the only way it should be said. "The temple breathes without me when it has to. That's how I know we did it right." Ben bowed the way a nephew bows to an uncle who is also his teacher and also his neighbor and also the person who once burned the bread so badly the smoke alarm sang harmony with the fountains. Luke put his hand on Ben's neck like he had the day of the remembrance and felt the living force course through bones that had become steady by failing and trying again. In the morning, Ben left with a bag and a map and a wrench and a pot and a packet of spices labeled, in Leia's hand, for making peace taste like something. Han stood on the steps and shouted something rude and loving. Chewbacca lifted a hand. Ahsoka squeezed Ben's shoulder and said, "You'll do," which was the highest praise she gave anyone. Mon Mothma told him to send her budgets. Tala cried and Kessa tried not to and failed. Yassik pressed a spoon into Ben's palm like a medal. R2 beeped a string of notes that translated roughly to, "Don't be a show-off unless absolutely necessary." C-3PO tried to deliver a speech and forgot it halfway through and was rescued by a child who recited it better. Luke watched the ship rise and felt, in his bones, the precise joy of letting a story walk. He went back inside and mopped a floor because it needed mopping. He adjusted a bracket. He ate a bowl of noodles with not enough sweet salt and didn't add more because imperfection taught his tongue patience. That night, the city breathed as it always did, and the cold breathed as it always would, and the living force hummed and moved. Luke went to the Hall of Fountains and sat on the damp bench where Obi-Wan had once sat and where Qui-Gon sometimes stood like a wind. "You stayed," Qui-Gon said without appearing. "The way a voice occurs in a house, you know." "I did," Luke said. "I'm still staying." "You didn't save the galaxy," Qui-Gon said, amused and proud. "I set tables," Luke said. "I listened." "That's how galaxies get saved," Qui-Gon said, and Luke smiled because he knew and because it was still good to hear. Outside, on Coruscant, two lovers argued and decided to try again. A thief put a wallet back and sat on the temple steps without knowing why and watched the rain make hieroglyphs on stone until he understood that the world was asking him to learn a new alphabet. A senator voted against a bill that would have made her life smoother and another man smaller. A child put a flower on a stair and a droid delicately stepped over it. The fountains sang. The Jedi mended and taught and ate and slept. And in rooms where the cold had once expected to find stage lights and found instead a kitchen, stories kept ending and beginning with bowls and breath and names that were not chains but invitations.